In this compelling account, we delve into the story of Simon Maheu, a man whose life, ravaged by a profound cocaine addiction, culminated in a terrifying break from reality. What began as an innocent car journey quickly devolved into a horrifying, almost demonic bloodbath. What started as a simple favor for a friend tragically concluded with 80 brutal stab wounds and a desperate manhunt across Nottingham's rooftops. This is a curious and unsettling narrative, infused with a distinctly spiritual undertone. We will, however, refrain from delving too deeply into the more unsettling aspects of the case, primarily because the pervasive and repeated use of the word demonic within the official court records is, quite frankly, rather disquieting. Instead, we take a look at this highly unusual case, the subsequent police investigation, and the dramatic trial that followed. Long before Simon Maheu became synonymous with the chilling act that compelled residents across Nottinghamshire to double-check their car doors, his name was already a fixture in local headlines, albeit for a different kind of recklessness: speeding. In 2018, he epitomized the kind of driver who viewed a 30 miles per hour speed limit not as a legal obligation or even a mere suggestion, but as a deeply personal affront to his perceived prowess as a motorist. High on both Class A and Class B drugs, he instigated a perilous car chase with the police, during which he reached a staggering 123 miles per hour in a 30 miles per hour zone. He recklessly sped through red lights at 70 miles per hour and frequently veered onto the wrong side of the road in a desperate bid for escape. Miraculously, Maheu emerged uninjured from the vehicle and attempted to flee on foot, only to be apprehended by the police a short distance away. He was subsequently sentenced to a year in prison, having admitted guilt to charges of dangerous driving and 2 counts of drug driving. Even then, he appeared to be a man driven by a visceral cocktail of adrenaline and a deep-seated, simmering resentment towards anything that dared to move at a pace slower than his own frantic internal rhythm. In hindsight, this earlier episode served as a terrifyingly accurate trailer for the true horror movie his life would eventually become. But there was a deeper reason for his destructive tendencies. Beneath the facade of a boy racer's bravado lay a man who had been professionally trained to be a weapon. Maheu was an ex-soldier, a man extensively taught to survive in high-stakes environments, only to be abruptly dropped back into the mundane world of suburban life and supermarket meal deals. His transition back to civilian life hadn't merely been rocky, it had been an absolute landslide. Despite not having experienced active combat, he nevertheless grappled with profound PTSD and an escalating paranoia during this period. His burgeoning daily cocaine habit served merely as a potent accelerant, akin to pouring a gallon of petrol onto an already raging fire each morning. By the spring of 2025, Maheu wasn't just using drugs, he was utterly submerged in them. Cocaine and a military-grade paranoia had become his ultimate, destructive power couple. He sat at his home in Mansfield, convinced that the world was inexorably closing in on him. The true timeline of his catastrophic collapse began in earnest on Monday, the 5th of May, 2025. While the rest of the country was unwinding from the bank holiday weekend, Maheu was in Ripley, Derbyshire, busily proving that his capacity for chaos wasn't limited to the roads. Inside a private home, his internal war finally spilled over, manifesting in a bizarre, drug-fueled display of dominance. He transformed a domestic setting into a terrifying hostage thriller. He violently restrained a woman, his fiancée, and her child, binding them to a chair. This act, while perhaps suggesting a desperate search for an external scapegoat for the torment raging within his own mind, was in stark reality a harrowing domestic siege. During the struggle, in a moment of frantic self-destruction, he even managed to stab himself in the leg. When Derbyshire police arrived, he fled, now officially a man on the run. By Tuesday afternoon, the 6th of May, Maheu was firmly on the police radar, though his friend, who would later become his victim, remained unaware of the impending danger. Maheu desperately needed to move, and he needed a way to do so without drawing the attention of the authorities, knowing they were closing in. This is when he reached out for a favor. He called a man he considered a friend, who also happened to be a taxi driver. This man, in a staggering display of misplaced faith in humanity, actually answered the phone. Maheu's request was simple: a lift to his mother's house. It was the kind of favor friends routinely do for one another, provided, of course, that one of those friends isn't a ticking time bomb. The two men had known each other for years, once friends, or at least friendly enough that when Maheu asked for a ride, the victim said yes. That single decision alone would cost him almost everything. The car journey through Mansfield was a masterclass in claustrophobic tension. As they navigated West Lane, precisely what was said inside the vehicle is known only to the two men involved. But it didn't take long for events to catastrophically derail. Abruptly, an argument erupted, sharp and sudden, the kind that doesn't build gradually but explodes without warning. The fallout began like a spark igniting a room filled with petrol. While the victim desperately tried to navigate the evening traffic, Maheu was navigating a full-blown psychotic break. He didn't just get angry, he became something far more terrifying, he became demonic. Inside the cramped cabin, the blade finally emerged. The car veered wildly across the lane, narrowly missing oncoming drivers who were simply trying to get home for dinner, before slamming into a wall outside the local co-op. Both men spilled onto the pavement, and under the stark streetlights, Maheu unleashed a savage and merciless attack. What followed outside the co-op was less a fight and more a one-sided massacre. In full view of shoppers, who were likely just hoping to pick up a pint of milk for their evening meal, Maheu launched a relentless assault. Armed with a knife and a seemingly bottomless reservoir of rage, he stabbed the victim approximately 80 times. 80 times. That isn't merely an assault, that speaks of repetitive strain injury. At that point, you aren't even fighting anymore. The sheer physical effort required to stab someone 80 times, or to do 80 of anything, is immense. Try tapping your foot 80 times, or even counting up to 80, it's a hell of a lot. Even the Count on Sesame Street would likely give up by 20. As sirens finally began to close in, Maheu did the only thing his drug-addled mind could conceive of: he went up. He scrambled onto a nearby roof, perched there like a gargoyle in a tracksuit, watching the paramedics desperately try to keep the victim alive before he vanished across the rooftops into the night. He opted for the parkour method of evasion, presumably hoping the police wouldn't think to look up. From his precarious vantage point on the tiles, Maheu surveyed the very neighborhood he had just traumatized. But a roof is a lonely place for a man on the move. Seeking more comfortable surroundings and a faster mode of transport, he broke into a home in Burton Joyce. He evidently decided that the best way to maintain a low profile was to commit a residential burglary and steal another car. For a man who had already made headlines for his driving, stealing a car to escape the scene of an attempted murder was a remarkably bold choice. It was the criminal equivalent of doubling down on a losing hand while the casino is quite literally on fire. The man didn't last long. You can only outrun the police for so long when you've left a distinctive trail of blood, crashed cars, and traumatized witnesses across 2 counties. When the police finally caught up with him, they didn't just find a speeder or a burglar, they found a man who had just spent 24 hours methodically checking off every major crime on the list. Before the stabbing, he had already managed to fit in 2 counts of false imprisonment in Ripley, where he tied up his fiancée and her child. It had been a productive 24 hours by any metric, provided your metric is maximum human suffering. As Maheu was being hauled into the custody suite, looking less like a combat-hardened soldier and more like a man who had been dragged backward through a hedge, the major crime unit began the arduous task of piecing together the 24 hours of sheer insanity. The initial investigation was a frantic exercise in dot joining. The police didn't just have an attempted murder on their hands, they had a kidnapping in Derbyshire, a burglary in Burton Joyce, and a stolen car that had been driven with a kind of reckless abandon usually reserved for a demolition derby. The co-op car park was transformed into a meticulous grid of yellow evidence markers. They weren't just searching for the knife, which Maheu had thoughtfully discarded during his rooftop park hour session, they were searching for the why. What they found in the wreckage of the victim's car was blood on the upholstery, blood on the dashboard, and a trajectory of violence that strongly suggested the victim had been fighting for his life while simultaneously trying to keep the car from killing anyone else. As the detectives began to extract additional data from the phones recovered during the arrest, a specific name kept repeatedly popping up: Paige Tomlinson. While Maheu was the blunt force instrument of the attack, Tomlinson was the logistical officer. The investigation into Tomlinson revealed a level of help that clearly crossed the line from misguided loyalty into criminal complicity. This wasn't just a casual conversation, she had been the one to orchestrate Maheu's movements. When the police came knocking on her door, they weren't looking for a witness, they were looking for an accomplice. She was swiftly apprehended and charged with assisting an offender, a charge that carries the heavy weight of knowing exactly what kind of monster you are helping to hide. The police interviews with Maheu were, by all accounts, a masterclass in drug-fueled deflection and the hollow echoes of a broken military mind. Across the table in the interview room, the detectives presented him with their irrefutable facts: the 80 wounds, the terrified family in Ripley, the stolen car, and the witnesses who saw him perched on a roof like a man possessed. The accused's defense even then was beginning to take its final, fractured shape. It was a chaotic cocktail of "I don't remember" and "the world was out to get me." He leaned heavily into his paranoia, a man convinced that his friend had somehow betrayed him, though he couldn't quite articulate how. The detectives, however, were far more interested in the cocaine-induced red mist than his tactical delusions. They watched a man who had spent his life speeding towards a wall finally sit in silence after the devastating impact. By the time the Crown Prosecution Service got their hands on the file, the charges were piling up considerably. This wasn't just one bad night, it was a catalogue of misery. The final list of charges presented to Maheu was a testament to his destructive productivity: attempted murder for the 80 stab, demonic display on West Lane, 2 counts of false imprisonment for tying up his fiancée and her child to a chair in Ripley, a move that effectively ended his domestic life with a roll of duct tape, burglary for the uninvited guest appearance in the home in Burton Joyce, and theft of a motor vehicle for his final, high-speed getaway attempt. As for Paige Tomlinson, the charges were simpler, but no less career-ending: assisting an offender. She had chosen her side. At Nottingham Crown Court on the 15th of January, 2026, when the proceedings began, the courtroom was treated to a blow-by-blow account of a man who had effectively turned his own psyche into a scorched earth zone. The prosecution presented the cold, hard number of 80 stab wounds. The victim, a man who by all rights of biology and physics should have been merely a memory, provided harrowing testimony that painted Maheu not as a disgruntled friend, but as something fundamentally other. He described a man who had undergone a chilling physical transformation in that car. The label demonic was the only word the victim could find to describe the look in Maheu's eyes as he wielded the blade. It was the look of a man who wasn't just killing a person, but was desperately trying to slaughter the ghosts of his own past. The jury sat in a heavy, nauseating silence as the merciless nature of the attack was laid bare. Maheu's defense team faced an incredibly difficult job. They had to find a way to humanize a man who had tied up a child and stabbed a friend 80 times. They leaned heavily on the broken soldier narrative. They spoke of his time in the army, his severe PTSD, and a mind so warped by trauma and paranoia that he genuinely believed he was under siege. It was a desperate plea. While the court acknowledged his service, the judge was emphatically not in the mood for excuses. The paranoia argument was significantly undercut by the sheer volume of cocaine Maheu had shoveled into his system. The court's consensus was clear: you don't get to claim military trauma as a shield when you've spent your civilian life fueling your inner demons with Class A drugs and high-speed car chases. The PTSD may well have been the foundation, but Maheu had spent years building a towering temple of violence on top of it. Before the main event, the court dealt with Paige Tomlinson. Her defense was a classic misguided loyalty plea: the girl got caught up in a whirlwind she didn't understand. But the digital trail told a different story. She had been a facilitator, the one who handled the logistics, while Maheu handled the steel. The judge wasn't buying the innocent bystander routine. She was sentenced to 18 months for her role in assisting an offender. It was a sharp, sobering reminder that if you help a monster find his way to a victim, the law is going to ensure you share some of the scenery behind bars. She was led away, leaving Maheu to face the music alone. Then came the moment for Maheu. The judge didn't just sentence him, he utterly dismantled him. He branded Maheu as extremely dangerous, a label that in the UK legal system carries specific and profound weight, meaning the court believes you pose a permanent threat to society. The tally of his crimes read out like a shopping list from hell: attempted murder, the main event on West Lane, false imprisonment, the duct tape nightmare in Ripley, burglary and theft, the Burton Joyce guest appearance. The sentence was a crushing 19 years. In the world of British sentencing, that is, effectively, a lifetime. Mahugh's final descent wasn't merely a tragedy of errors, it was a deliberate, drug-fueled demolition. To stab a man 80 times on a public pavement is to declare war on the very idea of humanity. It wasn't just an attack on a person, it was a demonic break from reality that transformed a mundane trip into a scene from a slasher film. Today, Mahugh sits in a cell. He leaves behind a trail of physical and psychological wreckage that no 19-year sentence can truly repair. At the conclusion of these cases, I often present a twist, and here is what I see. Mahugh tried to erase the only person in his life who didn't see him as a monster by attempting to kill his friend. In doing so, Mahugh wasn't just committing a crime, he effectively killed the only version of Simon Mahugh that was still worth anything.